Hi, I'm Alexis Cooney, and I'm a senior at Loyola Sacred Heart. I want to start my talk with a moment of silence. Take a deep breath, open your hearts, and listen for the Lord. Was that hard? Well, either you're lying, or you are a lot better at being silent than I am. I grew up as a cradle Catholic, going to Catholic school, going to youth group and legendary lodge, and even the occasional retreat. My mom became my youth minister in 7th grade, and, well, the point is that my faith was everywhere around me. And most of the time, it felt like I was going through the motions or pretending to be Catholic. I would go through faith highs during Legendary Lodge, but it was easy to lose. My sophomore year, I joined CYC Board, which was an amazing experience. Having 5 separate weekends to focus on my faith with other Catholics my age only helped my spiritual life grow. I felt like I had finally figured out how to sustain my faith life. I got to convention that year riding around on this faith high. Now, for convention, we had set up 24-hour adoration in the chapel next door to the cube. While we were waiting for the participants to show up, another board member stopped by and suggested that a few of us go to adoration. Now, the key of 24-hour adoration is that Jesus is not left alone at any point over that period. So I figured I would go and spend some time in the chapel so I could get my share out of the way and relieve the burden on the people already in the chapel. A few minutes in, I looked up and realized I was the only person there. I decided I was okay with staying for a few more minutes and went back to praying. But at this point, I was already starting to get worried. I was right in front of Jesus, and yet I couldn't feel his presence like I normally did. Instead, I was left with this growing hole in my chest that was quickly filling up with fear. Still being winter in Montana, it started to grow dark quickly, until I was left with flickering candles and low lights. Then the wind began to pick up, catching in the old pipes of the chapel wall. I cannot stress enough that the wind in the pipes sounded like voices screaming. At this point, I was kneeling in front of the altar, talking out loud to myself through my terror and trying desperately to feel any spark of Jesus within me. Outside, I could faintly hear everyone else singing and celebrating God without me. I did not feel comforted. Instead, I knew I was stuck with a God who couldn't bother to be present during the most terrifying experience of my life. I spent 2 hours alone and afraid in the chapel, left feeling more empty than ever. The message of this story is not to avoid adoration. The truth is, this wouldn't be a testimony without a test, and I'm here to tell you that I failed mine. After leaving the chapel, I decided I was done believing in a God who wouldn't help me. So I shut him out. I spent the rest of convention feeling empty and bitter, and carried those feelings with me for the next 2 weeks. At the end of those 2 weeks were track and field divisionals, and I was hoping to overcome last year's disappointment of scratching a state qualifying long jump, and then placing just short of going anyway. So carrying the disappointment of last year and the anger of the last 2 weeks, I was clearly ready to compete. Long jump started off as badly as you would imagine, and not only did I scratch, but I also managed to jump off the wrong foot. By the end of the day, I had scratched twice by jumping off the wrong foot, and definitely was not going to stay with the one correct jump I had made. Faced with crushing disappointment, I decided I was being petty and did the only thing I could. I started praying to God for forgiveness. The last 2 weeks were enough to teach me that I did not want a life without faith. When I was in the chapel, I thought I had been open and vulnerable to God, but in reality, I was too busy talking to myself to listen. A true relationship with God requires silence. The Old Testament has a great story about Elijah. Running for his life, Elijah is following instructions to meet God on the mountain of Horeb. Hiding in a cave, he waits for the Lord to pass by. Now, there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and stood at the entrance of the cave. When our world is full of noise and distractions, it takes courage to be silent. All too often, we try to talk above everyone else in an attempt to be heard. Faith is not just about us. Prayer is not just about me asking Jesus for a favor and throwing a thank you in at the end. If I truly want to follow Christ, I have to establish a two-way relationship with God. That means being silent so I can listen and wait for God. That means trusting that God has a plan and will share it with me if I ask. That means knowing I am worthy to receive his love. Our culture views silence as emptiness, as rejection, as loneliness. We are taught to fill our lives with people and jobs and music and school and sports and whatever else we can fit into our busy schedules. Our world leaves very little time for silence. As Catholics, we must understand that not all silences are the same. And the silence is when we are closest to God. My junior year, one of my best friends struggled heavily with depression. No matter what I said or did, her thoughts constantly turned against her. She was the villain in her own mind, a constant burden to those around her and completely undeserving of love. Since she is atheist, I couldn't quite convince her of God's love, but I was able to use the experience of feeling trapped in the chapel to reach out and empathize. For 2 hours, I had felt what it was like to be entirely alone and unloved, even when I was surrounded by someone who loved me more than words could express. The most horrifying and lonely point of my life became a moment of empathy that I could use to strengthen my relationship with one of my closest friends. Now, don't get me wrong, I am no expert on dealing with depression. I can and will listen, but God has created people far more capable of helping you heal than me. With the coronavirus keeping us all locked inside, I think we have all started to reflect on what it means to be a community. For the first time in, over 3 years probably, I didn't go to Mass on Sunday. It was such a strange feeling to not have that part of my life. In the last 2 weeks, everything has been unsettled. I lost at least 2 weeks of track, if not the whole season. Sunday Mass, convention, and even going to class like a regular high school student. Being isolated with my family has made me realize how many of God's graces I have taken for granted. It takes courage to make your voice heard. It takes even more courage to be silent and listen. When we are at our weakest, God steps in. For me, I find it hard to believe I'm worthy of that help. I try so hard to speak over the silence and carry my own cross. But even Jesus needed Simon. On our own, Humans are stupidly weak creatures, and God knows this. It takes years of effort to become strong. Like any relationship, it takes time to build a prayer life, but we have to believe we are worthy of it and throw our hearts fully into the effort. Like Elijah in the cave, be courageous in the silence and know you are worthy of greeting God. Thank you.